A lone wildlife photographer watched in disbelief as a massive grizzly bear trudged through waist-deep snow straight toward his remote cabin, collapsed at his doorstep, and did something no wild animal had ever done before. It gently pawed at his door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Making soft, whimpering sounds that would break anyone's heart when he discovered why this 700-pound apex predator risked everything to seek human help during the worst blizzard in decades. Even this hardened mountain veteran couldn't fight back his tears. Jack Morrison had spent the last 15 years documenting wildlife in the rugged wilderness of Montana's Glacier mountain range. His secluded cabin, perched high in the remote reaches of the Blackfoot Valley, had weathered countless storms and witnessed countless animal encounters. But nothing in his extensive experience could have prepared him for what unfolded on that fateful morning in late January, during one of the most severe winter storms to hit the region in over 50 years. The day had started like any other winter morning at the cabin. Jack was reviewing footage from his wildlife cameras while the bitter wind howled outside, rattling the windows with each powerful gust. The temperature had plummeted to -30 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and the latest weather report warned of another 48 hours of brutal conditions ahead. He had just finished his morning coffee when he heard it, a sound that stood out even against the howling storm. A deep, rumbling sound, followed by what seemed almost like a knock at his door. At first, Jack dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his mind. Living alone in the wilderness for so long, he'd learned that the imagination could sometimes run wild during these intense storms. But then he heard it again, more distinct this time, a deliberate sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Approaching his frost-covered window, he carefully wiped away the condensation and peered out into the swirling snow. What he saw made him stumble backward in shock. There, barely visible through the heavy snowfall, was one of the largest grizzly bears he'd ever encountered. But something was terribly wrong with this picture. The massive creature wasn't displaying any of the typical aggressive behavior Jack had documented countless times before. Instead, the bear was hunched over, its movements sluggish and labored as it pushed through snowdrifts that nearly engulfed it. Most striking of all was the bear's face. There was an almost human-like expression of desperation in its eyes. Jack's first instinct, honed by years of wildlife photography and survival training, was to check his rifle and ensure his bear spray was within reach. But as he observed the animal's behavior through his window, his professional expertise told him this was something unprecedented. Grizzlies should be deep in hibernation this time of year, not wandering through a deadly blizzard, and they certainly never approached human dwellings with such deliberate purpose, unless desperately searching for food. But this bear wasn't displaying any signs of food-seeking behavior. Its body language spoke of something else entirely. Exhaustion, distress, and what appeared to be a focused determination. The animal's fur was caked with ice, suggesting it had been traveling for hours, perhaps days, through the merciless storm. As Jack watched, transfixed, the bear did something that challenged everything he knew about wild animal behavior. It reached out one massive paw and gently scratched at his cabin door, producing that same knocking sound he'd heard earlier. The bear's eyes met his through the window, and in that moment, Jack witnessed something he would never forget. There was an intelligence there, a desperate plea for help that transcended the natural barriers between species. The bear's breath came out in ragged clouds of steam, its powerful body trembling not just from cold, but from what appeared to be sheer exhaustion. This was no random encounter, no simple case of a wild animal straying too close to human habitation. This bear had come here with a purpose. As a wildlife photographer who had documented countless bear encounters, Jack knew every rule in the book about bear behavior and safety protocols. He had captured images of bears in almost every situation imaginable: hunting, playing, caring for cubs, even fighting. But nothing in his vast experience could explain what he was witnessing. The bear's behavior defied everything known about these powerful predators, especially during the winter months when they should be safely denning. The storm continued to intensify around them, the wind driving sheets of snow against the cabin. With increasing fury, the temperature was still dropping and daylight was already growing dim, despite it being only mid-morning. Jack found himself facing a decision that would challenge everything he believed about wildlife interaction and test the limits of human compassion. As he stood there, watching this magnificent creature's desperate plea for help, he knew the next few minutes would change his life forever. What he didn't know was that his decision would lead to a discovery that would astound the entire wildlife conservation community and challenge our understanding of animal intelligence and empathy. The minutes that followed felt like hours as Jack wrestled with an impossible decision. Every survival manual, every wildlife expert, and every ounce of common sense screamed against what he was considering. Yet there was something in that bear's behavior that defied conventional wisdom. Through the frosted window, he could see the animal's condition deteriorating rapidly. The bear's breaths were coming in shorter gasps now, its massive body shivering violently against the brutal cold. Jack's cabin, though modest, was equipped with every tool a wildlife photographer might need for documenting and studying animal behavior. Multiple cameras were mounted strategically around the exterior, and his internal monitoring equipment was state-of-the-art. He quickly accessed the footage from the past few hours, and what he saw astonished him even further. The bear had actually been observing his cabin from the tree line for several hours before approaching, studying the building and its surroundings with an almost methodical patience. The footage revealed something else that sent a chill down Jack's spine. This wasn't just any grizzly. He recognized the distinctive scar pattern on its right shoulder, visible even through the ice-matted fur. This was Aurora, a female bear he had photographed extensively over the past 3 years. She was well known among local researchers for her unusually calm demeanor and high intelligence. Jack had documented her raising 2 cubs, teaching them to fish and navigating the complex terrain of the Glacier mountain range, but those cubs were nowhere to be seen now. As he analyzed the footage more closely, he noticed disturbing details about Aurora's current condition. Her normally powerful gait was unsteady, and her usually well-maintained fur was not just ice-covered, but matted with what appeared to be blood in some places. More concerning was her behavior. She had circled the cabin multiple times, testing different approaches, almost as if she was working out the safest way to make contact. Jack's satellite phone buzzed, temporarily breaking his concentration. It was Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist he often collaborated with from the Montana Wildlife Research Center. He had sent her some initial photos of the situation, hoping for some professional insight. Her response was immediate and emphatic. This behavior was unprecedented. In her 20 years of studying grizzly bears, she had never seen or heard of anything like this. More importantly, she confirmed what Jack had already suspected. Aurora should be deep in hibernation, and the fact that she wasn't suggested something was seriously wrong. The bear's breathing had become more labored now, and her attempts to stay upright were becoming visibly difficult. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the past hour alone, and the weather radar showed the worst of the storm was yet to come. Jack knew that without shelter, even a creature as hardy as a grizzly bear wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions, especially one already in distress. Using his cabin's external cameras, Jack zoomed in on Aurora's face, capturing details he hadn't noticed before. Her eyes, usually sharp and alert, were glazed with exhaustion, but there was something else there, an almost human-like awareness of her situation. She wasn't acting on pure instinct anymore. This was calculated behavior. Every few minutes, she would look back the way she had come, then return her gaze to the cabin door, making that same gentle pawing motion that seemed so out of character for a creature of her size and power. The wind continued to howl outside, driving the wind chill factor down to dangerous levels. Ice was forming on Aurora's fur even as Jack watched, and her movements were becoming increasingly sluggish. He knew that grizzlies were incredibly resilient animals, capable of surviving extreme conditions, but everything about this situation was wrong. They weren't supposed to be active in these conditions, and they certainly weren't supposed to be seeking human help. Jack's monitoring equipment picked up another concerning detail. Aurora's body temperature, visible through his thermal imaging camera, was dangerously low. Grizzly bears typically maintained excellent temperature regulation, even in harsh conditions, but something had clearly pushed this bear far beyond her physical limits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The regular patches of frozen blood in her fur suggested an injury, but in these conditions, he couldn't determine its severity. As darkness began to creep in, far too early in the day due to the storm's intensity, Jack found himself facing a moment of truth. Everything he knew about wildlife photography and animal behavior told him to stay behind his locked door and simply document this unusual event. But everything he had learned about Aurora over the years, everything he understood about animal intelligence and survival, was pushing him toward an unthinkable course of action. The bear's eyes met his again through the window, and in that moment, Jack made a decision that would either prove to be the biggest mistake of his life or the beginning of one of the most extraordinary wildlife encounters ever documented. As he reached for his cabin door, he knew he was about to break every rule in the Wildlife Safety Handbook. What he didn't know was that his actions over the next few hours would not only challenge our understanding of animal behavior, but would also lead to a discovery that would send shockwaves through the entire wildlife conservation community. With trembling hands but determined resolve, Jack began implementing an emergency protocol he had never imagined he'd need to use. His years of wildlife photography had taught him to always be prepared, but nothing had prepared him for this. He quickly transformed his cabin's mudroom into a makeshift observation area, using heavy-duty tarps to create a protective barrier between it and his main living space. His hands moved swiftly, driven by the urgency of Aurora's deteriorating condition outside. The sound of his satellite phone ringing again momentarily interrupted his preparations. It was Dr. Chen again, this time with even more disturbing news. The thermal imaging photos he had sent her revealed that Aurora's core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. More concerning were the patterns of heat loss visible in the images. They suggested internal bleeding, possibly from a serious injury. The combination of injury, cold, and extreme exertion had pushed the bear far beyond normal survival thresholds. Jack's monitoring equipment continued to capture Aurora's increasingly desperate situation. The bear's movements had become alarmingly sluggish, and the ice forming on her fur was now thick enough to be visible even through the storm. The wind chill had dropped to -50 degrees, and the weather station's alerts warned of even worse conditions approaching. The storm was intensifying into what meteorologists were calling a century event, the kind of winter storm that only happened once every 100 years. As he made his final preparations, Jack's mind raced through everything he knew about grizzly bear behavior. These were creatures that typically avoided human contact at all costs, especially during winter months. Yet here was Aurora, one of the most intelligent bears he had ever documented, deliberately seeking human assistance. The implications were staggering. Either she was so desperate that all natural instincts had been overcome, or she possessed a level of reasoning that science had yet to acknowledge in her species. The mudroom preparations complete, Jack began the next phase of his plan. He positioned his best cameras to document whatever was about to unfold, not just for scientific purposes, but as potential evidence should things go wrong. He knew he was about to attempt something that most would consider suicidal, but his years of observing Aurora had given him a unique insight into her character. There was an intelligence in her eyes that went beyond mere animal instinct. Outside, Aurora's condition was worsening by the minute. Her attempts to stay upright were failing more frequently now, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular. The thermal imaging showed her core temperature continuing to drop, and the blood-matted patches in her fur had begun to freeze solid. Jack knew he was running out of time. Whatever had driven this magnificent creature to seek human help, she wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions. Using the cabin's external speakers, normally reserved for deterring wildlife, Jack began playing recordings of soft bear vocalizations he had collected during his years of research. These were specifically cubs' contentment sounds, which he hoped might help calm Aurora. Her reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She lifted her head weakly at the sounds, making a soft moaning response that he had never heard before in all his years of bear observation. Jack's hand rested on the door handle as he ran through his safety protocols one final time. He had positioned bear spray and his tranquilizer gun within easy reach, though he prayed he wouldn't need either. The mudroom was secure, the cameras were rolling, and he had left a detailed video message explaining his actions in case things went wrong. He had also sent his GPS coordinates and situation update to Dr. Chen, who was attempting to organize an emergency response team, though the storm made any immediate help impossible. The moment of truth had arrived. Jack took a deep breath, mentally, preparing himself for what he was about to do. Through the window, he could see Aurora's eyes following his movements, her expression showing an almost human-like combination of hope and desperation. The wind howled with renewed fury, driving sheets of snow and ice against the cabin walls, with enough force to make the whole structure shudder. As he began to open the door, Jack's mind flashed through all the possible outcomes of what he was about to do. Best-case scenario. He would successfully provide temporary shelter to a desperate animal and potentially make a groundbreaking discovery about bear intelligence. Worst-case scenario. Well, he preferred not to dwell on that. But something in Aurora's behavior, in the deliberate way she had sought him out, told him this was the right decision. What happened in the next few moments would either validate his incredible trust in this wild creature's intelligence or prove to be a fatal mistake. As the door began to open, letting in a blast of Arctic air and swirling snow, Jack had no way of knowing that his actions were about to uncover a mystery that would challenge everything wildlife experts thought they knew about animal consciousness and the complex bonds between humans and wildlife. The true reason for Aurora's desperate plea for help was far more extraordinary than anything he could have imagined. The moment the cabin door fully opened, time seemed to stand still. The howling wind drove snow and ice into the mudroom, but Jack's attention was completely focused on Aurora. The massive grizzly bear, now mere feet away, made no aggressive move. Instead, she remained in her submissive position, her eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. The next few seconds would determine whether his trust in this extraordinary animal had been tragically misplaced. Aurora's reaction defied everything Jack knew about wild bear behavior. Despite her weakened state, she managed to lower her head even further, releasing a soft whimpering sound that seemed completely at odds with her massive size. The blood in her matted fur was more visible now, and Jack could see that her injuries were worse than he had initially thought. Deep gashes ran along her left side, partially hidden by ice and frozen blood. Whatever had happened to her, it had been violent. Using the gentle, steady voice he had developed over years of wildlife observation, Jack began speaking softly to Aurora. He maintained eye contact while slowly moving backward into the mudroom, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The bear's response was remarkable. She watched him intently, adjusting her position with careful, almost calculated movements, as if trying to appear as non-threatening as possible despite her enormous size. The thermal cameras continued recording as Aurora made her way to the mudroom entrance. Her movements were painfully slow, each step clearly causing her distress. The temperature difference between the bitter cold outside and the relative warmth of the mudroom caused steam to rise from her fur, creating an otherworldly scene that Jack's cameras captured in stunning detail. He knew he was documenting something unprecedented in the history of wildlife observation. As Aurora finally managed to pull herself fully into the mudroom, Jack noticed something that made his heart race. There were peculiar marks in the frozen, blood on her fur, marks that looked distinctly like bullet wounds. The realization hit him hard. Someone had shot at this bear, likely forcing her out of hibernation during the worst storm in recent history. The thought filled him with a mixture of anger and deeper concern. If Aurora had been attacked by poachers, there could be more to this situation than just an injured bear seeking help. The next few moments were crucial. Jack had prepared the mudroom with emergency medical supplies, having worked with wildlife. Veterinarians often enough to know basic treatment procedures. But treating an injured grizzly bear was far different from documenting one from a safe distance. Aurora's behavior, however, continued to amaze him. As he slowly reached for the medical kit, she tracked his movements, but remained completely still, her labored breathing the only sound besides the howling wind outside. Using the cabin's external cameras, Jack could see that Aurora's tracks in the snow were already disappearing under fresh snowfall. The storm was intensifying even further, with the weather station now reporting near-record low temperatures. The wind chill had dropped to -60 degrees, and visibility outside had decreased to less than 10 feet. They were effectively trapped together in this small space, a wildlife photographer and an injured grizzly bear, while one of the worst storms in Montana history raged around them. The mudroom's warm air was beginning to thaw the ice in Aurora's fur, revealing more details about her injuries. The bullet wounds, while serious, didn't appear to be life-threatening on their own. But combined with the extreme cold and exhaustion, they had pushed her to the brink of collapse. Jack noticed something else as the ice melted. There were defensive wounds on her paws and face, suggesting she had been in some kind of struggle before being shot. His satellite phone buzzed again. Dr. Chen had managed to reach out to a network of wildlife conservation officers and local authorities. The news she shared was disturbing. There had been reports of illegal hunting activity in the region over the past week, despite the approaching storm. Several other bears' denning sites had been found empty, with signs of human interference. The poachers were apparently taking advantage of the extreme weather conditions, knowing that law enforcement and wildlife officials would have difficulty responding. As Jack processed this information, Aurora did something that left him speechless. She slowly turned her massive head to look back out into the storm, making a series of soft, distressed sounds he had only ever heard mother bears use with their cubs. Then she turned back to him, her eyes containing what could only be described as a plea. In that moment, Jack understood with shocking clarity. Aurora hadn't just come here for herself. There was something else out there in the storm, something that would explain why a mother bear would risk everything to seek human help. The realization hit him like a physical blow. If his suspicions were correct, there was far more at stake here than just one injured bear. But the storm was reaching deadly levels of intensity, and any attempt to go outside now would be nearly suicidal. As he watched Aurora's increasingly distressed behavior, Jack knew he was about to face another impossible decision. What he didn't know was that the true scope of this situation was far larger and more dangerous than he could have imagined, and the next few hours would test the limits of both human courage and animal intelligence in ways that would astound the wildlife conservation community. The next 30 minutes became a delicate dance between man and bear as Jack carefully began treating Aurora's wounds. His expertise was in photography, not veterinary medicine, but years of working alongside wildlife researchers had taught him the basics of emergency animal care. What amazed him was Aurora's continued cooperation. She remained perfectly still as he cleaned the bullet wounds, only flinching occasionally when he had to remove fragments of ice from her matted fur. Using his satellite phone's camera, Jack transmitted images of Aurora's injuries to Dr. Chen. Her response confirmed his worst fears. The bullet wounds showed signs of professional hunting equipment, not the typical weapons used by recreational hunters. This suggested organized poaching activity, likely targeting denning bears during their most vulnerable period. The revelation made Aurora's desperate journey to his cabin even more remarkable. She had somehow escaped the poachers, and instead of simply fleeing, had deliberately sought human assistance. As Jack worked, the storm outside reached new levels of ferocity. The cabin's weather station was recording wind gusts of over 80 miles per hour, and the temperature continued to plummet. The external cameras showed visibility had dropped to near zero, creating conditions that would make any rescue attempt impossible. Yet Aurora's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. Despite her exhaustion and injuries, she kept looking back toward the door, making those same distressed vocalizations that pulled at Jack's heart. The satellite phone buzzed again, this time with troubling news from local law enforcement. They had been tracking a sophisticated poaching operation that had recently moved into the area. These weren't ordinary hunters. They were well-equipped professionals who specialized in targeting bears during hibernation, when the animals were most vulnerable. The storm had provided perfect cover for their illegal activities, as they knew rescue and law enforcement resources would be stretched thin. A sudden change in Aurora's behavior caught Jack's attention. She had managed to stand despite her weakened condition and was now pawing gently at the door. Her movements were purposeful, almost desperate, as she looked back at Jack with what could only be described as pleading eyes. The maternal distress calls she was making had become more frequent, and her anxiety was palpable. Jack's mind raced as he pieced together the clues, the defensive wounds, the maternal calls, the desperate journey through the storm, the thermal. Cameras on his cabin's exterior suddenly picked up something that made his blood run cold. In the swirling snow, barely visible through the whiteout conditions, there was a faint heat signature moving slowly through the storm. It was small, far too small to be an adult bear, and it was moving erratically, as if struggling against the brutal conditions. The realization hit Jack like a physical blow. There was a cub out there, likely wounded, trying to follow its mother's tracks before they disappeared under the fresh snowfall. Jack's mind raced through the implications. Aurora hadn't just been running from poachers, she had been leading them away from something, or someone. She had probably hidden her cub somewhere before making the journey to his cabin, either to protect it from the poachers or to scout a safe route through the storm. Now, with her tracks disappearing and the storm intensifying, the cub was in grave danger of losing its way. The satellite phone's weather alert warned that conditions were about to deteriorate even further. A secondary storm system was merging with the current one, creating what meteorologists were calling a perfect storm scenario. Temperatures were expected to drop another 20 degrees within the hour, and wind speeds would make any movement outside virtually impossible. Time was running out. Aurora's behavior became increasingly frantic as she alternated between pawing at the door and turning to Jack with those incredibly expressive eyes. Her wounds were still bleeding, and her strength was clearly fading. but maternal instinct was driving her to attempt the impossible. She was trying to go back out into the lethal storm to save her cub, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. Jack found himself facing another impossible decision. The rational part of his mind knew that venturing out into the storm would be almost certainly fatal. The temperature was far below zero, visibility was negligible, and the wind was strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. Search and rescue teams wouldn't even attempt a mission in these conditions. But as he watched Aurora's desperate attempts to return to her cub, he knew he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. The thermal imaging showed the cub's heat signature. Growing weaker, its movements becoming more erratic. Without immediate help, the young bear wouldn't survive another hour in these conditions. Jack began gathering his extreme weather gear, knowing he was about to attempt something that went against every survival instinct and safety protocol. What he didn't know was that his decision would lead him into a confrontation that would put both human and animal lives on the line and reveal a threat far more dangerous than the storm itself. Jack's hands moved swiftly as he donned his extreme weather gear, layering up with everything he had available. His photography work in harsh conditions had taught him the importance of proper preparation, but he knew he was about to push the limits of both his equipment and his survival skills. The satellite phone's weather alerts were now coming in rapid succession, each one more dire than the last. The storm had evolved into what meteorologists were calling a polar hammer, a rare phenomenon where Arctic air masses collide and create conditions lethal to any exposed life. Aurora watched his preparations intently, her intelligent eyes tracking every movement. Despite her injuries and exhaustion, she remained alert, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed almost encouraging. The thermal imaging continued to track her cub's heat signature, but the signal was growing weaker by the minute. The young bear's movements had become increasingly disorganized, suggesting it was starting to succumb to the cold and disorientation. As Jack completed his preparations, he activated his cabin's emergency protocols. Multiple cameras would record everything, transmitting data to secure servers in case anything went wrong. He had also left detailed video messages for both authorities and his family, explaining his actions and the extraordinary circumstances that had led to them. His satellite phone was fully charged, though he knew its battery wouldn't last long in these extreme temperatures. Dr. Chen's voice crackled over the satellite phone one last time, her tone urgent and concerned. The weather modeling showed the storm was about to reach its peak intensity, with wind speeds approaching hurricane force. More disturbing was the news about the poachers. Local authorities had found abandoned hunting blinds and sophisticated tracking equipment near several known bear denning sites. These weren't opportunistic hunters. This was a well-organized operation targeting hibernating bears and their cubs. Jack's gear included everything he could think to carry while still being able to move through the storm. Emergency flares, AE, powerful LED flashlight, a compact thermal imaging device, first aid supplies, and an emergency shelter pack. He also carried his best camera. If they survived this, he knew the documentation would be crucial for both wildlife research and potential legal proceedings against the poachers. Aurora's behavior changed dramatically as she realized Jack was preparing to go out. She became more animated, moving between the door and Jack with renewed energy despite her injuries. Her vocalizations shifted to a series of soft huffs and rumbles, sounds Jack had previously documented her using to encourage her cubs during challenging situations. The parallel wasn't lost on him. This 700-pound apex predator was essentially treating him as she would one of her own cubs, trying to guide and encourage him. The weather station's readout painted a grim picture of what awaited them outside. The temperature had dropped to -45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill approaching -80. Visibility was down to less than 5 feet, and the snow was falling so heavily it was actually visible on the thermal imaging as a static-like interference. These were conditions that could kill an unprotected human in minutes, and even an animal as hardy as a bear cub couldn't survive much longer. Just before opening the door, Jack received one final piece of information that made the situation even more urgent. Dr. Chen had analyzed the thermal imaging data of the cub and noticed something alarming. Its movement patterns suggested it had been injured as well. The young bear was favoring one side, likely wounded during the encounter with the poachers. This explained why it hadn't been able to keep up with its mother during their escape. As Jack reached for the door handle, Aurora did something extraordinary. She positioned herself beside him, her massive shoulder pressing gently against his leg in what seemed like a protective stance. Despite her own injuries and exhaustion, her maternal instincts were driving her to try to shield this human who was risking his life to help her cub. The gesture nearly brought tears to Jack's eyes. In all his years of wildlife photography, he had never witnessed such a clear display of cross-species cooperation and trust. The moment the door opened, the storm hit them like a physical wall. The wind howled with such force that it seemed to have a voice of its own, and the snow and ice particles felt like needles against any exposed skin. Aurora immediately moved forward, her powerful form breaking trail through the deep snow. Despite her injuries, she seemed to have found renewed strength in the urgency of their mission. What she and Jack didn't realize was that they weren't the only ones tracking the lost cub through the storm. Somewhere out there in the whiteout conditions, other figures were moving with purpose, their high-tech equipment cutting through the storm's fury as they closed in on their young target. The first few steps into the storm nearly knocked Jack off his feet. The wind howled with such ferocity that it seemed to come from all directions at once, driving particles of ice and snow that cut like tiny razors against any exposed skin. Aurora moved ahead of him, her massive form creating a partial windbreak that made movement slightly easier. The bear's tracking abilities, even in these extreme conditions, were nothing short of miraculous. Despite her injuries and the near-zero visibility, she seemed to know exactly which direction to take. Jack's compact thermal imager was struggling against the storm's intensity. The screen kept freezing over, requiring him to constantly wipe it clear with his heavily gloved hands. The cub's heat signature appeared as a faint, flickering dot, growing weaker by the minute. But there was something else on the thermal display that caught his attention. Several other heat signatures, too regular in their movement to be wildlife, were converging on the same area from different directions. Aurora suddenly stopped, her entire body tensing. Even through the howling wind, Jack could hear her low growl of warning. His years of experience with wildlife told him this wasn't just a response to the storm. She had sensed something, or someone else out there in the whiteout conditions. The bear's behavior confirmed his worst fears about the thermal signatures he'd detected. The poachers hadn't given up their pursuit. They were using the storm as cover to track down their wounded quarry. The temperature continued to plummet, and Jack could feel the cold seeping through his layers of protective gear. His satellite phone's display showed -52 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors pushing it well below -90. These were conditions that could freeze exposed flesh in seconds. His breath froze instantly as it left his mask, creating ice crystals that had to be constantly cleared away. The storm had created a world of white violence where visibility extended barely beyond arm's reach. Aurora's path led them into a dense stand of pine trees where the wind's fury was slightly reduced. Here, Jack noticed something that made his blood run cold despite the already freezing temperatures. Fresh boot prints in the snow, partially filled but still visible, showed that others had passed through this area recently. More disturbing were the signs of sophisticated equipment being dragged through the snow, wide, smooth tracks that suggested some kind of sled or transport device. The bear's behavior became increasingly agitated as they moved deeper into the trees. She would stop frequently, testing the air with her sensitive nose, then look back at Jack with what seemed like growing urgency. The thermal imager showed they were getting closer to the cub's location, but the other heat signatures were converging faster. Jack realized with growing dread that this was becoming a race, not just against the lethal cold, but against well-equipped professionals who had already shown they were willing to use deadly force. Suddenly, Aurora froze, her entire body going rigid. Through the swirling snow, Jack caught a glimpse of artificial light, the kind produced by high-end tactical flashlights. The poachers were using the storm's cover to close in on their target, likely equipped with night vision and thermal imaging gear far superior to his portable unit. He could hear faint voices carried on the wind, barely audible over the storm's roar, coordinating their movements with professional precision. The satellite phone vibrated in his pocket, Dr. Chen trying to reach him with what was probably crucial information. But retrieving it would require removing his gloves, and even a few seconds of exposed skin in these conditions could lead to instant frostbite. Aurora made the decision for him, nudging him urgently toward a dense thicket of pine branches. Her instincts, honed by years of survival in this harsh wilderness, told her they needed to move carefully now. The thermal imager's screen flickered again, but this time revealed something that made Jack's heart race. The cub's heat signature had moved. It was now inside what appeared to be a small natural cave or hollow, likely seeking shelter from the brutal wind. This explained why it had survived so long in the lethal cold. But the poacher's heat signatures were closing in from multiple directions, creating a carefully coordinated net that was tightening around the young bear's location. Aurora's soft whimpers of distress told Jack she could sense her cub was close. Her powerful muscles trembled with the effort of restraining herself from rushing forward, her maternal instincts warring with the caution born of her recent encounter with the poachers. Through the curtain of wind-driven snow, Jack could now make out dark shapes moving with purpose, their tactical gear visible in brief glimpses between gusts. They were racing not just against the storm and time, but against a well-organized team of professionals who had every advantage in this deadly game of survival. The next few moments unfolded in a series of heart-stopping flashes as Jack and Aurora crept closer to the cave entrance. The wind had shifted, driving the snow in horizontal sheets that provided brief moments of concealment between gusts. Through these temporary veils, Jack could see the poachers more clearly now. 4 figures in white winter camouflage moving with military precision through the storm. Their equipment was state-of-the-art: night vision goggles, advanced thermal, imaging rifles, and what appeared to be tranquilizer guns modified for extreme weather conditions. Aurora's behavior suddenly changed. Her massive body tensed and a low rumble vibrated through her chest. Not a growl of aggression, but a sound Jack had documented before. A mother bear's call to her cubs. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. From within the small cave came a weak whimper, barely audible over the storm's fury. The cub was alive, but the sound of its cry revealed how desperately weak it had become. The thermal imager confirmed Jack's worst fears. The young bear's heat signature was dangerously faint, indicating severe hypothermia. The poachers had heard it too. Their movements became more focused, converging on the cave's location with practiced efficiency. Jack could now see why they had chosen this storm for their operation. The extreme weather conditions that made rescue almost impossible also provided perfect cover for their illegal activities. His satellite phone's display showed -52 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors pushing it well below -90. These were conditions that could freeze exposed flesh in seconds. His breath froze instantly as it left his mask, creating ice crystals that had to be constantly cleared away. The storm had created a world of white violence, where visibility extended barely beyond arm's reach. Aurora's path led them into a dense stand of pine trees, where the wind's fury was slightly reduced. Here, Jack noticed something that made his blood run cold despite the already freezing temperatures. Fresh boot prints in the snow, partially, filled but still visible, showed that others had passed through this area recently. More disturbing were the signs of sophisticated equipment being dragged through the snow, wide, smooth tracks that suggested some kind of sled or transport device. The bear's behavior became increasingly agitated as they moved deeper into the trees. She would stop frequently, testing the air with her sensitive nose, then look back at Jack with what seemed like growing urgency. The thermal imager showed. They were getting closer to the cub's location, but the other heat signatures were converging faster. Jack realized with growing dread that this was becoming a race, not just against the lethal cold, but against well-equipped professionals, who had already shown they were willing to use deadly force. Suddenly, Aurora froze, her entire body going rigid. Through the swirling snow, Jack caught a glimpse of artificial light, the kind produced by high-end tactical flashlights. The poachers were using the storm's cover to close in on their target, likely equipped with night vision and thermal imaging gear far superior to his portable unit. He could hear faint voices, carried on the wind, barely audible over the storm's roar, coordinating their movements with professional precision. The satellite phone vibrated in his pocket, Dr. Chen trying to reach him with what was probably crucial information. But retrieving it would require removing his gloves, and even a few seconds of exposed skin in these conditions could lead to instant frostbite. Aurora made the decision for him, nudging him urgently toward a dense thicket of pine branches. Her instincts, honed by years of survival in this harsh wilderness, told her they needed to move carefully now. The thermal imager's screen flickered again, but this time revealed something that made Jack's heart race. The cub's heat signature had moved. It was now inside what appeared to be a small natural cave or hollow, likely seeking shelter from the brutal wind. This explained why it had survived so long in the lethal cold. But the poacher's heat signatures were closing in from multiple directions, creating a carefully coordinated net that was tightening around the young bear's location. Aurora's soft whimpers of distress told Jack she could sense her cub was close. Her powerful muscles trembled with the effort of restraining herself from rushing forward, her maternal instincts warring with the caution born of her recent encounter with the poachers. Through the curtain of wind-driven snow, Jack could now make out dark shapes, moving with purpose, their tactical gear visible in brief glimpses between gusts. They were racing not just against the storm and time, but against a well-organized team of professionals who had every advantage in this deadly game of survival. The next few moments unfolded in a series of heart-stopping flashes as Jack and Aurora crept closer to the cave entrance. The wind had shifted, driving the snow in, horizontal sheets that provided brief moments of concealment between gusts. Through these temporary veils, Jack could see the poachers more clearly now, 4 figures in white winter camouflage, moving with military precision through the storm. Their equipment was state-of-the-art: night vision goggles, advanced thermal imaging rifles, and what appeared to be tranquilizer guns, modified for extreme weather conditions. Aurora's behavior suddenly changed. Her massive body tensed, and a low rumble vibrated through her chest, not a growl of aggression, but a sound Jack had documented before, a mother bear's call to her cubs. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. From within the small cave came a weak whimper, barely audible over the storm's fury. The cub was alive, but the sound of its cry revealed how desperately weak it had become. The thermal imager confirmed Jack's worst fears. The young bear's heat signature was dangerously faint, indicating severe hypothermia. The poachers had heard it too. Their movements became more focused, converging on the cave's location with practiced efficiency. Jack could now see why they had chosen this storm for their operation. The extreme weather conditions that made rescue almost impossible also provided perfect cover for their illegal activities. Normal law enforcement would never attempt to patrol in these conditions, and any tracks or evidence would be quickly buried under feet of fresh snow. Through his frozen mask, Jack caught fragments of their radio communications carried on the wind. They were speaking in coded phrases, but their intent was clear. They planned to tranquilize both cubs and mother if necessary. The cruel logic was simple. Bears were worth far more to certain collectors if captured alive, especially cubs that could be raised in captivity. The fact that many wouldn't survive the trauma of capture and transport was merely calculated as an acceptable loss in their profit margins. Aurora was nearly vibrating with tension now, torn between her instinct to rush to her cub and her recent experience with the poacher's weapons. The wounds in her side were evidence of their earlier encounter, and even in her desperate state, she seemed to understand that a direct confrontation would be fatal. Instead, she looked at Jack with those incredibly intelligent eyes, and he could almost read her thoughts. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. The satellite phone vibrated again in Jack's pocket. This time, despite the risk of frostbite, he knew he had to check it, removing his outer glove for just a few seconds, during which the cold bit into his hand like a living thing. He saw Dr. Chen's message: law enforcement mobilizing. Heavy military helicopter with night capabilities en route. ETA 15 minutes. Keep them occupied. Those 15 minutes suddenly seemed like an eternity as Jack watched the poachers close in on the cave. The storm had reached such intensity that the trees around them were creaking and groaning under the weight of ice and wind. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and Jack's gear was reaching its functional limits. Ice had formed inside his mask, and his movements were becoming increasingly difficult as the cold penetrated deeper into his equipment. But the deteriorating conditions had given Jack an idea. As a wildlife photographer, he had spent years learning to use the environment to his advantage. Now those skills might save both the bears and himself. His camera gear included high-intensity strobe lights designed to capture wildlife images in dark conditions. In this wind-driven snow, such lights would create a blinding wall of reflected light, temporary, but possibly enough to create confusion. Aurora seemed to sense his intention. As Jack carefully reached for his equipment, she positioned herself between him and the poachers, her massive form providing cover. The wind howled with renewed fury, driving ice particles that struck like tiny bullets against any exposed surface. The poachers were now less than 50 feet from the cave entrance, their weapons raised as they approached with professional caution. The cub cried out again, its voice weaker than before. Aurora's response was immediate, a combination of distress and determination that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. The poachers paused at the sound, their tactical formation tightening as they assessed this new threat. They couldn't see Jack and Aurora through the storm yet, but that was about to change. As he prepared to implement his desperate plan, Jack knew the next few moments would determine not just the survival of these bears, but possibly the fate of many other animals targeted by this sophisticated poaching operation. Jack's fingers, nearly numb despite his specialized gloves, fumbled with his camera equipment as he prepared to execute his desperate plan. The high-intensity strobes, normally used for capturing split-second wildlife behavior in darkness, would serve a very different purpose today. He positioned 3 units in a triangular pattern, using the wind-driven snow as a natural diffuser. Aurora watched his movements intently, seeming to understand that something important was about to happen. The poachers were now close enough that Jack could hear fragments of their communications over the howling wind. They were speaking in clipped, professional tones, coordinating their approach to the cave with practiced precision. Their equipment marked them as experts: thermal scopes that cut through the storm's fury, tactical gear adapted for extreme weather, and what appeared to be custom-modified tranquilizer rifles designed to operate in sub-zero conditions. Through his own thermal imager, Jack could see the cub's heat signature growing alarmingly weak. The young bear had stopped moving, conserving what little energy it had left. The cave, while providing shelter from the wind, was still well below, freezing. Without immediate intervention, the cub would slip into terminal hypothermia within minutes. Aurora's distress was palpable. Her massive body trembled with the effort of restraining herself from rushing to her baby's aid. The satellite phone's display showed 12 minutes until the military helicopter's arrival. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours in these conditions. The storm had intensified even further, creating a white wall of driven snow that reduced visibility to almost zero. The temperature had dropped to minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors approaching minus 100. Even breathing had become difficult. As the air was so cold, it felt like inhaling shards of glass. Jack's plan relied on perfect timing and the storm itself. The poachers' sophisticated equipment gave them a huge advantage, except for one crucial weakness. Their thermal imaging and night vision gear worked by amplifying available light and detecting heat signatures. In conditions of extreme visual overload, such equipment could become worse than useless, potentially blinding its users. The trick would be creating that overload at exactly the right moment. Aurora suddenly tensed, her head swinging toward a new sound barely audible over the storm's roar. The poachers had begun their final approach to the cave, moving in a tight formation designed to cover all possible escape routes. Their confidence was evident in their movements. They had no reason to expect any resistance in these brutal conditions. Whoever was operating in this storm would have to be either desperate or insane. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. Jack activated the first strobe unit just as the lead poacher reached the cave entrance. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The light, reflected and multiplied by millions of snow particles, created a blinding flash that overwhelmed the poachers' light-amplifying equipment. Their shouts of surprise and pain were whipped away by the wind as they instinctively ripped off their now useless night vision goggles. Aurora understood instantly that this was their moment. With incredible speed for an animal her size, she burst from cover and charged toward the cave. The poachers, temporarily blinded and disoriented, scrambled to regroup. Jack triggered the second and third strobes in rapid succession, creating a disorienting pattern of reflected light that made it impossible to distinguish shapes or distances in the swirling snow. The chaos that followed was both terrifying and precisely what Jack had hoped for. The poachers' superior equipment had become a liability, their tactical formation broken as they struggled to adapt to suddenly being blind in the storm. Through his own regular vision, unaffected by the strobes, Jack could see Aurora reaching the cave entrance. The mother bear's reunion with her cub was brief but powerful. She gently nudged the weakened young bear with her nose, making soft sounds of encouragement. But they weren't safe yet. The poachers were already recovering, switching to backup equipment and regrouping with professional efficiency. Jack could hear their leader barking orders, reorganizing their approach. The strobes had bought them, perhaps a minute, maybe less. The cub was too weak to walk, and even Aurora's strength was failing after her ordeal. As Jack rushed forward to help, he knew they were still dangerously exposed. The satellite phone vibrated again, 9 minutes until the helicopter's arrival. Through the storm's fury, Jack could hear the poachers coordinating their second approach, this time with conventional weapons. They had abandoned any pretense of capturing the bears alive. Now, with their expensive equipment damaged and their operation compromised, they would eliminate any evidence of their activities. Race against time had become even more desperate, and the storm was about to unleash its final, deadly assault. The next few moments became a desperate race against both human and natural threats. Jack reached the cave entrance just as the storm unleashed its most furious assault yet. The wind had become a living thing, howling with such force that it physically pushed against them as they tried to move. Aurora had managed to reach her cub, but the young bear was barely conscious, its small body temperature dangerously low. The bullet wound in its leg, now visible, explained why it hadn't been able to keep up during their initial escape. Through the maelstrom of wind and ice, Jack could hear the poachers regrouping. Their voices carried fragments of urgent communication. They were switching to a containment strategy, trying to seal off all possible escape routes. The strobes had cost them their night vision advantage, but these were professionals who had clearly trained for contingencies. The sound of charging weapons and the metallic clicks of safeties being released cut through even the storm's fury. Jack's satellite phone showed 7 minutes until the helicopter's arrival, but the weather was deteriorating so rapidly that he wondered if even a military aircraft could operate in these conditions. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, and the wind chill had reached levels that could freeze exposed flesh in seconds. His own equipment was beginning to fail. Ice had formed inside his mask, and his movements were becoming dangerously sluggish as the cold penetrated deeper into his gear. Aurora's behavior suddenly changed. Despite her exhaustion and injuries, she positioned herself between the cave entrance and the approaching threats, her massive body creating a shield for both Jack and her cub. The intelligence in her eyes was unmistakable as she looked at Jack, then at her cub, then toward a barely visible path that led deeper into the forest. She was trying to tell him something, and after years of studying bear behavior, he understood. She was offering to draw the poachers away, giving him a chance to escape with her cub. The nobility of her offer struck Jack like a physical blow. This mother bear, already wounded and exhausted, was willing to sacrifice herself to save her baby. But Jack had a different plan. His emergency gear included a specialized rescue sled designed for transporting photography equipment through deep snow. With some quick modifications, it could carry the injured cub. The challenge would be moving fast enough to escape the poachers while protecting their precious cargo from the lethal cold. As Jack quickly assembled the sled, Aurora maintained her guard position, her powerful senses alert to every movement beyond the cave. The poachers were implementing their containment strategy with practiced efficiency, their footsteps in the snow revealing a steadily tightening circle around their position. The storm, now reaching its peak intensity, had created a white wall of driving snow and ice that reduced visibility to arm's length. In these conditions, the fight would be close and desperate. The cub whimpered weakly as Jack carefully lifted it onto the modified sled. Its fur was caked with ice, and its small body trembled continuously. The bullet wound, though not immediately life-threatening, had clearly caused significant blood loss. Using supplies from his emergency medical kit, Jack quickly wrapped the injury and secured the young bear against the brutal cold. Aurora watched every movement, her trust in this human who was handling her baby both extraordinary and humbling. 6 minutes until the helicopter's arrival. The poachers were close enough now that Jack could hear the crunch of their boots in the snow, their movements coordinated and deliberate. They had switched to a different tactical formation, one designed to handle multiple moving targets in low visibility conditions. Their professionalism made them even more dangerous. These weren't opportunistic hunters, but trained killers who wouldn't leave witnesses to their operation. Just then, Aurora did something that demonstrated a level of intelligence that would later astonish wildlife experts. She began deliberately breaking branches and marking trees in a pattern that led away from their actual escape route, creating a false trail that even experienced trackers would find convincing in these conditions. The strategy was so sophisticated that it took Jack a moment to understand what she was doing. She was setting up a deception that might give them the precious minutes they needed. As Jack finished securing the cub and checking his own gear one final time, a new sound cut through the storm's roar, the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle, followed by the whine of a bullet passing too close for comfort. The poachers, had given up on capturing their quarry alive. Now it was a simple matter of eliminating evidence and witnesses. Aurora's response was immediate and fierce. She released a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, a sound of defiance and protection that carried even through the storm's fury. The next moments exploded into chaos as Aurora's roar triggered an immediate response from the poachers. Multiple rifles opened fire, their muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the swirling snow like lightning. Jack pulled the rescue sled into motion just as Aurora launched herself toward the source of the gunfire, her massive form disappearing into the white void. Her attack wasn't meant to engage the poachers directly. She was creating a diversion, drawing their fire away from Jack and her cub's escape route. The violence of the storm actually worked in their favor now, the howling wind and dense snow making accurate shooting nearly impossible. Jack could hear the poachers shouting to each other, their professional calm cracking as they dealt with both a charging grizzly and conditions that pushed the limits of human endurance. The temperature had dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds and cause immediate frostbite through any gap in clothing. Aurora's strategy proved brilliant in its effectiveness. Her false trail, combined with her aggressive display, had completely disrupted the poachers' carefully planned containment. The sounds of chaos behind them told Jack that their opponents were now scattered, struggling to maintain formation while dealing with a mother bear's fury. Each of Aurora's roars seemed to come from a different direction, creating confusion about her actual location in the whiteout conditions. Jack's satellite phone showed 4 minutes until the helicopter's arrival, but the situation had become even more desperate. The cub's condition was deteriorating rapidly, its small body temperature dropping despite the emergency wrappings. The rescue sled, while effective in normal conditions, fought against him in the deep snow and hurricane-force winds. Every step was a battle against elements that seemed determined to claim their lives. Through his thermal imager, Jack caught occasional glimpses of Aurora's heat signature as she continued her complex deception. She was implementing a strategy that showed remarkable sophistication, appearing briefly before the poachers' thermal scopes, then vanishing into the storm, drawing them further from the actual escape route. Her intelligence and sacrifice made Jack's throat tight with emotion. This was far beyond simple animal instinct. This was calculated planning and self-sacrificing courage. The wind suddenly shifted, driving ice particles with such force that they penetrated any exposed surface, like tiny bullets. The change in wind direction also carried sounds more clearly. The poachers' voices, Aurora's strategic roars, and a new sound that made Jack's heart race, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. But the storm's fury had reached such intensity that even a military aircraft would have extreme difficulty operating safely. The risk of the helicopter crashing in these conditions was dangerously high. A bullet cracked past alarmingly close, followed by a pained roar from Aurora. The sound froze Jack's blood. She had been hit again, yet her strategy continued. If anything, her movements became even more erratic and confusing to their pursuers. She was fighting through her injuries, running on nothing but maternal determination, and what seemed like an almost human understanding of the stakes involved. The poachers' frustrated shouts confirmed that her tactics were working. They were completely disoriented in the white chaos. 3 minutes to the helicopter's arrival. The cub stirred weakly in the rescue sled, responding to its mother's distant calls. Jack checked its condition quickly. The young bear's pulse was thready but persistent, its will to live as strong as its mother's determination to save it. The bullet wound had started bleeding again, the dark drops freezing instantly as they fell on the snow. They needed to reach shelter soon, or all of Aurora's sacrifice would be in vain. The storm reached a new level of violence, creating what meteorologists call a white darkness, a condition where the snow is so dense that it actually absorbs light, reducing visibility to zero. Jack was navigating purely by his thermal imager now, the screen frequently freezing over and requiring precious seconds to clear. His own condition was becoming critical. Despite his extreme weather gear, the cold had begun to penetrate to his core, and his movements were becoming dangerously sluggish. Aurora's roars suddenly changed pattern, shorter, more urgent vocalizations that carried a clear warning. Through the thermal imager, Jack saw why. Two of the poachers had figured out their deception and were closing in on the actual escape route. Their professional training had helped them see through the bear's sophisticated strategy. Now they were moving with deadly purpose, their weapons raised and ready. The helicopter's sound was getting closer, but in these conditions, even if it arrived in time, there was no guarantee it could help them. The world had narrowed to a brutal equation of survival as Jack pushed through the storm, pulling the rescue sled with its precious cargo. The helicopter's sound grew stronger, but the weather had created a deadly paradox. The same conditions that had hidden them from the poachers now made aerial rescue nearly impossible. The military pilot would be flying blind, relying solely on instruments in conditions that pushed the limits of even the most advanced aircraft. Aurora's warning calls suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than her roars. Through the thermal imager, Jack caught glimpses of her heat signature moving with deadly purpose. She had stopped her deception, strategy, and was now circling back, preparing to confront the two poachers who had seen through her tactics. The intelligence of her actions continued to amaze. She was setting up an ambush, using the storm's fury to mask her approach. 2 minutes until the helicopter's arrival. The cub had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign that hypothermia was reaching critical levels. Jack's own condition wasn't much better. His movements had become mechanical, each step requiring conscious effort as the cold worked deeper into his body. The thermal imager's screen was now freezing over every few seconds, the battery struggling against temperatures it was never designed to handle. Without it, they would be completely blind in the white darkness. The poachers were closing in with professional efficiency, their own thermal equipment cutting through the storm's visual chaos. They moved in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military or special operations training. These weren't simple hunters, but hardened professionals who had likely done this many times before. Their voices, carried on the wind, revealed cold calculation rather than anger or frustration. They were treating this like a cleanup operation, methodically eliminating all evidence of their activities. Suddenly, Aurora's strategy revealed itself in all its devastating effectiveness. She had used the storm's dynamics to approach the poachers from their blind spot, timing her movement with the wind gusts to mask any sound. The first poacher had no warning before 700 pounds of maternal fury burst from the white void. The sound of his scream was cut short as Aurora's massive paw sent his weapon flying into the storm. His partner's reaction was immediate and professional. He swung his rifle toward the bear, but the swirling snow and Aurora's incredible speed made accurate aim impossible. The helicopter was close now, its powerful engines fighting against wind speeds that approached 90 miles per hour. Jack could hear the pilot's voice crackling over his satellite phone, coordinating with ground units that were still too far away to help. The storm had created a deadly race. They needed to survive just a few more minutes, but those minutes seemed like an eternity as multiple threats converged on their position. Aurora's confrontation with the poachers had bought them precious time, but Jack knew she was operating on pure instinct and maternal determination now. Her wounds were severe, and the cold was affecting even her massive frame. Through brief glimpses in the thermal imager, he could see her movements becoming less coordinated, her incredible strength finally beginning to fade. Yet she fought on, her sacrifice driven by something deeper than mere survival instinct. The cub stirred weakly in the rescue sled, responding to the sounds of its mother's struggle. The young bear's resilience was remarkable. Despite its injuries and the lethal cold, it clung to life with the same determination that drove Aurora to protect it. Jack checked the satellite phone again. 1 minute until the helicopters. Arrival, if it could even find them in these conditions. The storm had created what meteorologists called a whiteout bubble, a sphere of zero visibility that made conventional navigation impossible. A new sound cut through the chaos, the sharp crack of another rifle, followed by Aurora's roar of pain. She had been hit again, but instead of retreating, she pressed her attack with even greater fury. The poachers had lost their tactical advantage, forced to deal with a mother bear's desperate last stand while fighting against conditions that threatened to kill them all. Their professional composure had finally cracked, their voices revealing genuine fear as they faced a force of nature they couldn't control. Jack's world had become a blur of wind-driven snow and desperate motion, his focus narrowed to the simple act of keeping the rescue sled moving. His thermal imager flickered one last time before dying completely, leaving them blind in the storm's fury. The helicopter's sound was deafening now, but without visual contact, rescue remained uncertain. Through the white darkness, he could hear Aurora's continued battle with the poachers, her roars of defiance carrying over the storm's howl. They were so close to safety, yet the final moments would prove to be the most dangerous of all. The storm reached its apocalyptic peak as the military helicopter fought to maintain position somewhere above them in the white void. The aircraft's powerful searchlight cut through the snow-filled air in strobing flashes, creating surreal moments of illumination that revealed glimpses of the desperate scene below. Aurora's final stand against the poachers had become a primal battle of survival, her massive form appearing and disappearing in the chaos like a spirit of the wilderness itself. Jack's situation had become critical. Without the thermal imager, he was navigating purely by instinct and his years of experience in the wilderness. The rescue sled felt impossibly heavy now, each step forward a battle against both the physical weight and his own failing strength. The cold had penetrated so deeply that even breathing had become a conscious effort, each inhale feeling like shards of ice in his lungs. The cub lay motionless in the sled, its survival depending entirely on reaching shelter within the next few minutes. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the satellite phone, barely audible over the storm's roar. They were attempting a dangerous rescue technique used in extreme alpine conditions, using the aircraft's downdraft to temporarily clear a visibility window in the snow. It was an incredibly risky maneuver in these winds, requiring split-second timing and perfect coordination. One wrong move could send the helicopter spinning out of control, turning their rescue attempt into another disaster. Aurora's battle with the poachers had reached its climax. Despite her injuries and exhaustion, the mother bear had managed to separate the two men, using the storm's fury to her advantage. Her tactics showed an almost supernatural combination of raw power and strategic thinking. She would appear suddenly out of the white darkness, striking with devastating force before vanishing again into the swirling snow. The poachers' shouts revealed growing panic as they realized they had severely underestimated both the bear's intelligence and her desperate determination to protect her cub. The temperature had dropped to levels that shouldn't have been survivable. At -65 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it far lower, even their specialized cold-weather gear was failing. Ice had formed inside Jack's mask, making each breath a struggle. His movements had become dangerously slow, and he knew they were all approaching the absolute limits of endurance. Even Aurora, with her thick fur and massive bulk, was showing signs of succumbing to the lethal cold. Suddenly, the storm's dynamics shifted dramatically. The helicopter's powerful downdraft created a momentary dome of relative clarity, the swirling snow pushed back by the force of the rotors. In that brief window of visibility, the full horror of their situation became clear. Aurora was locked in combat with one of the poachers, her enormous form dwarfing her opponent despite her wounds. The second poacher was attempting to circle. Behind her, his rifle raised for a killing shot. Jack made a split-second decision that went against every survival instinct. Leaving the rescue sled in as sheltered a position as possible, he charged toward the second poacher. The man's focused attention on Aurora gave Jack the element of surprise. The impact sent them both sprawling in the deep snow, the rifle flying from the poacher's hands. The bitter cold made the fight seem almost surreal. Their movements slowed, as if underwater, each breath creating clouds of instant ice crystals in the air. The helicopter pilot's voice cut through again, warning that they could only maintain this position for a few more seconds before the wind would force them to abort. The searchlight swept across the scene again, revealing Aurora delivering a final, devastating blow to her opponent. The first poacher lay motionless in the snow, while Jack grappled with the second one in a desperate struggle. The cold had made their fingers too numb to grip weapons, reducing the fight to a primitive contest of survival. Aurora's intervention proved decisive. Despite her injuries and exhaustion, she somehow found the strength for one more charge. The sight of a fully grown grizzly bear rushing toward them was enough to break the second poacher's will to fight. He scrambled backward in panic, disappearing into the swirling snow beyond the helicopter's light. His survival instincts had finally overcome his professional training. Faced with both human and ursine opponents in lethal weather conditions, he chose flight over certain death. The helicopter's searchlight focused on a small clearing, indicating their only chance for rescue. Jack fought through the numbness and exhaustion to return to the rescue sled. The cub hadn't moved, its small body almost completely covered in ice now. Aurora appeared beside them, her fur caked with blood and ice, her movements showing the toll of her incredible battle. Together, they made their way toward the clearing, fighting against winds that threatened to knock them off their feet. With each step, the final moments of their rescue became a desperate race against failing bodies and lethal conditions. The helicopter's downdraft had created a temporary haven of visibility, but it also drove the wind chill to unimaginable levels. Ice crystals formed in the air itself, creating a glittering death cloud that seemed to steal the warmth from anything it touched. Jack's movements had become almost robotic, his mind focused solely on dragging the rescue sled those last crucial yards toward salvation. Aurora's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her fur was matted with frozen blood from multiple wounds, and her previously powerful stride had become an awkward stumble. Yet she maintained her protective position beside the sled, carrying her cub, her massive form still trying to shield them from the worst of the storm. The intelligence in her eyes remained sharp despite her physical exhaustion, scanning constantly for any sign that the poachers might return for a final attempt to stop them. The helicopter crew had deployed a rescue basket, but the wind kept snatching it away, making it dance erratically at the end of its cable. The pilot's voice crackled over the satellite phone with increasing urgency. They were rapidly approaching the absolute limits of what the aircraft could handle in these conditions. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, and ice was forming on the helicopter's rotor blades faster than the de-icing systems could handle it. Jack reached the rescue basket first, his hands so numb he could barely grip its edges. The cub lay motionless in the sled, its small body almost completely covered in ice despite the emergency wrappings. As he began the delicate process of transferring the young bear to the basket, Aurora's behavior changed dramatically. She became highly agitated, making soft sounds of distress as she watched her cub being lifted away from her. Her reaction demonstrated an understanding that amazed even Jack. She seemed to recognize that this strange metal container represented her baby's only chance for survival. The first attempt to raise the basket failed as a violent wind gust slammed it against the ground. The helicopter pilot fought to maintain position, the aircraft's engines screaming as they worked at maximum power. Jack's satellite phone crackled. With a final warning, they had less than 2 minutes before the helicopter would be forced to retreat, with or without them. The storm had reached such intensity that even this powerful military aircraft was being pushed to its operational limits. Aurora's next actions would later be studied by wildlife experts as evidence of extraordinary animal intelligence. Instead of panicking when her cub was loaded into the strange metal basket, she helped steady it with her massive body, seeming to understand that this was part of the rescue. Her behavior went beyond instinct, showing a level of reasoning that challenged conventional understanding of animal cognition. Despite her own desperate condition, she remained focused on her cub's survival. The basket finally began its ascent, swaying dangerously in the violent wind. Jack's relief at seeing the cub safely on its way quickly turned to concern as he looked at Aurora. The mother bear was swaying on her feet, her incredible strength finally exhausted by blood loss, cold, and the aftermath of her battle with the poachers. Her eyes met his, and in that moment Jack saw something that would haunt him forever, a combination of trust, gratitude, and what looked like resignation. Without warning, Aurora collapsed into the snow. Her massive body, which had seemed so powerful and indestructible, now looked vulnerable against the white ground. Jack's mind raced through options. The rescue basket would return for another lift, but Aurora weighed over 700 pounds. Even if he could somehow get her into the basket, the helicopter's cable system wasn't rated for that much weight, especially not in these extreme conditions. The pilot's voice cut through again, more urgent now. The storm was about to get even worse, if that was possible. They had time for one more rescue attempt before conditions would force them to abandon the area. The basket was already descending for Jack, but he found himself frozen in place, unable to leave Aurora lying there in the snow. After everything she had done, trusting humans against all instinct, fighting through her injuries, protecting both her cub and him from the poachers, abandoning her felt impossible. Aurora's eyes found his again, and in that moment she made a sound he had never heard before, a soft, almost gentle rumble that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere animal vocalization. She lifted her head slightly, looking toward the hovering helicopter, then back at Jack. The message was clear. She wanted him to go to make sure her cub survived. The nobility of her sacrifice struck him like a physical blow. This wild animal, this supposedly mindless beast, was choosing to give up her own chance at rescue to ensure her cub's survival. What happened in the next few minutes would be debated by wildlife experts and military personnel for years to come. Jack made a decision that defied both protocol and common sense. He refused to leave Aurora behind. Instead, he used his remaining strength to drag emergency survival equipment from his pack, working frantically to create a makeshift shelter around the fallen bear. The helicopter pilot's increasingly desperate calls went unanswered as Jack fought against time and the elements to give Aurora a chance at survival. His actions seemed like madness in the face of the storm's fury, but years of wilderness experience guided his hands even through the numbness and exhaustion. He used emergency thermal blankets to create a wind barrier, packing snow around the edges to create an improvised snow cave. The technique, normally used for human survival in extreme conditions, was Aurora's only hope for surviving until help could return. The bear's breathing had become shallow, but her eyes remained fixed on Jack, showing a trust that transcended natural barriers. The helicopter crew, realizing Jack wouldn't leave, made an unprecedented decision. Despite the extreme risk, they maintained position, using their searchlight to guide an incoming ground rescue team. The team had been fighting through the storm for hours, following the helicopter's coordinates. Their specially equipped vehicles had finally managed to break through the weather, bringing veterinary personnel and emergency medical equipment. The timing was critical. Both Jack and Aurora were showing severe signs of hypothermia. Aurora's rescue became an operation that would be studied in wildlife management courses. The ground team included experts in large animal transport, but moving a severely injured and hypothermic grizzly bear in lethal weather conditions was something none of them had attempted before. What made it possible was Aurora's continued extraordinary behavior. Even in her weakened state, she remained calm as the rescue team worked, as if understanding that these humans were trying to help her. The story of Aurora and her cub didn't end with their rescue. At the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, veterinarians were amazed by several discoveries. The cub's wounds, while serious, had been precisely inflicted. The poachers had deliberately tried to wound rather than kill, confirming their intention to capture rather than hunt. More remarkably, examination of Aurora's injuries revealed evidence of sophisticated veterinary care from previous encounters with humans. She had been tagged and treated by wildlife researchers years before, perhaps explaining her unusual trust in human assistance. Recovery was a long process for both bears. The cub, eventually named Storm by the Rehabilitation Center staff, showed remarkable resilience. Under careful veterinary care, both the bullet wound and the effects of hypothermia slowly healed. Aurora's injuries were more severe, requiring multiple surgeries, but her will to live proved as strong as her initial determination to save her cub. Throughout their recovery, the mother and cub remained together, their bond seemingly strengthened by their shared ordeal. The incident led to significant changes in wildlife protection efforts. The investigation into the poaching operation revealed a sophisticated international trafficking ring specializing in exotic animals. Aurora and Storm's story, documented by Jack's photographs and video footage, became powerful evidence in the campaign for stronger wildlife protection laws. The evidence collected during their rescue led to multiple arrests and the disruption of a major illegal wildlife trafficking network. Jack's footage of Aurora's intelligent behavior, particularly her sophisticated strategy in dealing with the poachers, sparked intense scientific interest. Her actions demonstrated levels of problem-solving and tactical thinking previously undocumented in wild bears. Wildlife researchers began reviewing other cases of bear-human interactions, looking for similar evidence of advanced cognitive abilities that might have been overlooked. Perhaps the most remarkable chapter in their story came 6 months later. Jack, having recovered from his own injuries, returned to his cabin to continue his wildlife photography work. One morning, he discovered familiar tracks in the snow around his cabin. A mother bear and cub had visited during the night. While he never saw Aurora and Storm directly again, he would occasionally find signs of their presence, distinctive paw prints, marking patterns on trees that matched Aurora's height, and once, a half-eaten salmon left on his doorstep like a gift. The cabin's security cameras sometimes captured nighttime footage of a large bear and her growing cub passing through the area. They never showed any aggression toward the cabin or its surroundings. Instead, their behavior suggested they were patrolling, almost as if checking on the human who had helped them. Local rangers reported that other bears in the area had become notably less aggressive toward humans, as if Aurora had somehow communicated her experience to her fellow creatures. Today, Aurora and Storm's story is taught in wildlife management courses as an example of the complex intelligence of wild animals and the potential for human-wildlife cooperation. The emergency protocols developed during their rescue have been adapted for use in other wildlife crisis situations. Their experience changed not only how we think about wild animals' cognitive abilities, but also how we approach wildlife conservation and protection. The events of that stormy night proved that sometimes the greatest acts of courage and intelligence can come from creatures we too often dismiss as merely wild animals. Aurora's desperate journey to seek human help, her sophisticated strategy to protect her cub, and her extraordinary trust in human assistance challenged our understanding of wildlife behavior. Her story reminds us that in the struggle for survival, the bonds between all living beings can transcend the barriers we think divide us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.